It was a typical day in Jerusalem. The scorching sun beat down on the dusty streets as Isaiah walked toward the temple. His heart was heavy, for King Uzziah, who had ruled for over half a century, had just passed away, leaving a void in leadership and an uncertain future for Judah. Isaiah entered the temple seeking comfort, unaware that he was about to experience something that would transform not only his life, but history itself. As he knelt to pray, something extraordinary happened. The veil between the physical and spiritual worlds was torn, and the temple ceiling seemed to open, revealing a vision of the heavenly throne. Isaiah was paralyzed, barely able to breathe at what he saw. The Lord of hosts was there, seated on a high and majestic throne, radiating a glory that filled not only the temple, but the entire universe. Yet it was not only the vision of God that left him speechless. Around the throne, he saw creatures he had never imagined existed. Seraphim, celestial beings of pure light and fire, each with 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. Awestruck, the prophet watched as these beings flew around the throne, calling to one another with voices that echoed into eternity. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is filled with his glory. With each proclamation, the temple doors shook and the air was filled with smoke. Isaiah fell to his knees, gripped by a fear that reached into the depths of his soul. How could he, a mere mortal, stand before such holiness? Words escaped his mouth almost involuntarily. Woe is me, I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then something miraculous happened. One of the seraphim flew to Isaiah, carrying a live coal taken from the altar. The celestial being touched the prophet's lips with it and said, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for." Isaiah's heart, once full of fear, now overflowed with peace. He heard the voice of the Lord asking, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" Without hesitation, the prophet responded, "Here I am, send me." This encounter with the seraphim and the vision of the heavenly throne marked the beginning of Isaiah's prophetic mission. His words, inspired by this incredible experience, echoed through the centuries, bringing hope, warning, and above all, a new understanding of the greatness and holiness of God. Seraphim are as fascinating as they are mysterious. The name Seraphim comes from the Hebrew word saraph, meaning burning, and these beings are literally the burning ones, or those who burn. Imagine beings made of pure celestial fire, radiating a light so intense that no human eye could bear to look directly at them. This fiery nature symbolizes absolute purity and the intensity of divine presence. Just as fire purifies metal, removing all impurities, seraphim embody the total holiness of God, consuming all that is not pure. However, the seraphim are not merely destructive fire. They are also a fire that illuminates, warms, and brings life, living manifestations of God's burning love, a love so intense and pure it resembles heavenly flames. The Bible doesn't provide a detailed description of their appearance, mentioning only their 6 wings, which has allowed artists and visionaries to imagine these beings as humanoid angels surrounded by flames, or as beams of light and fire in constant motion. Their 6 wings are highly symbolic. With the first pair, the seraphim cover their faces, a gesture of profound reverence and humility, for even these celestial beings cannot look directly upon the fullness of God's glory. With the second pair, they cover their feet, a sign of their creaturely status before the Creator, despite their elevated and glorious nature. This gesture also symbolizes readiness to serve, as if they are always prepared to carry out God's will. The third pair of wings is used for flying, representing their ability to act swiftly in divine service, always in motion, serving the Lord without laziness or hesitation. The sound that fills the heavenly throne room is not the soft harps or angelic choirs we often imagine. It is a powerful, eternal cry. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. This threefold cry of the seraphim is more than simple praise. Declaring God's holiness 3 times was a way to express the absolute superlative in Hebrew, emphasizing that he is incomparably holy, set apart from all creation in his absolute moral perfection. But what does it truly mean to be holy? The Hebrew word for holy, kadosh, conveys the idea of separation, of something wholly other. When applied to God, it means he is completely different from everything else that exists, above and beyond all creation, perfect in every way, and without any blemish or imperfection. Holiness is not merely one of God's attributes among others. It is the essence of who he is. All of his other qualities, such as love, justice, and mercy, flow from his fundamental holiness. That is why the seraphim cry, "Holy, holy, holy," not "love, love, love," or "power, power, power." This cry of the seraphim reminds us that God's holiness is not an abstract or distant truth. It is a living and vibrant reality that fills the universe. And notice that the seraphim don't just say that God is holy, they declare that the whole earth is full of his glory. This means that divine holiness is not confined to heaven, it permeates all creation. This vision invites us to see the world around us differently. If God's glory fills the whole earth, then every aspect of creation, from the farthest galaxies to the smallest particles, reflects divine holiness, calling us to a renewed respect and appreciation for the natural world. The unceasing cry of the seraphim also teaches us about the true spirit of these celestial beings. They never tire of proclaiming God's holiness, not out of obligation or empty ritual, but as a spontaneous and constant response to the glory they witness. This challenges us to reflect on our own enthusiasm. How often does our devotion become routine? The seraphim remind us that true inspiration flows from a continual recognition of God's holiness and glory, something that should permeate every aspect of our lives, not just designated moments of worship. Moreover, the cry of the seraphim reminds us of the spiritual reality that exists beyond our physical world. Amid the distractions and demands of daily life, it is easy to lose sight of eternal truths. But the seraphim, with their unending cry, remind us of God's holiness and majesty, whether we are fully aware of it or not. Isaiah's vision was an immersive experience that engaged all his senses. Each time the seraphim proclaimed God's holiness, the temple doors shook and the atmosphere filled with smoke. This trembling was no ordinary earthquake, but a physical manifestation of God's power and glory. Imagine the scene. With each proclamation from the seraphim, it was as if the entire universe quivered in reverence and acknowledgement of the Creator. In the Bible, tremors often accompany manifestations of divine presence. When God descended on Mount Sinai to deliver the 10 Commandments, the entire mountain shook violently. When Jesus died on the cross, the earth quaked. These tremors are tangible signs of God's reality and power, reminders that his presence is not distant, but a force that can literally shake the foundations of reality. In biblical tradition, smoke or cloud often symbolizes the presence of God. Think of the pillar of cloud that guided the people of Israel through the wilderness, or the cloud that descended over the tabernacle, filling it with divine glory. Smoke serves multiple purposes. On one hand, it conceals, just as the seraphim cover their faces, unable to bear God's glory directly. The smoke acts as a veil, protecting mortals from the overwhelming intensity of God's holiness, reminding us that no matter how much God reveals, he always remains partially mysterious. There are aspects of his nature that lie beyond our understanding. On the other hand, the smoke also reveals it is a visible sign of God's presence, making the invisible somewhat perceptible. It is as if God's glory is so intense that it overflows into the physical realm in the form of this smoke. Isaiah's experience of encountering this celestial vision is both human and revelatory. Faced with divine holiness and the purity of the seraphim, the prophet does not feel special or exalted. Instead, he is overcome by an intense awareness of his own unworthiness. "Woe to me," he cries, "I am ruined, For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." This passage teaches us much about the nature of encountering the divine. When we truly understand who God is in all his holiness and majesty, the natural response is not pride or self-confidence, but deep humility and a clear awareness of our own imperfections. Isaiah sees himself as a man of unclean lips. Why does he focus on his lips? In Hebrew culture, the lips symbolize not only speech, but a person's entire moral character. Isaiah, in essence, is saying, "Everything in me is impure compared to this perfect holiness I am witnessing." Notice also that Isaiah does not see himself as exceptionally impure. He acknowledges that he lives among a people of unclean lips. His confession is not merely personal, but a declaration about the human condition in the face of God's perfect holiness. All human distinctions of goodness and badness fade away, and everyone falls short of God's glory. Isaiah's exclamation, "I am ruined," reveals the genuine fear that accompanies an encounter with the divine. In the Bible, whenever someone catches a direct glimpse of God's glory, the initial reaction is fear, not a cowardly fear, but a reverent awe that acknowledges the infinite distance between creator and creature. This moment of self-awareness is crucial in the process of spiritual transformation. Before we can be useful in God's service, we must first see ourselves as we truly are. The encounter with divine holiness acts as a spiritual mirror, revealing flaws and imperfections we may not have even been aware of. However, the story does not end with this confession of unworthiness. The beauty of the narrative lies in what happens next. God does not reject Isaiah because of his impurity. Instead, he provides a means of purification, showing that recognizing one's own imperfection is merely the beginning of the path to redemption. Purification through divine grace, as happened with Isaiah, establishes a pattern repeated throughout Scripture and in the experiences of many believers. Only when we recognize our own need are we truly open to receiving God's transforming grace. Isaiah's experience challenges us to reflect on our attitude toward God, for we often approach him casually, forgetting his transcendent holiness. This vision reminds us that the fear of the Lord is not a paralyzing fear, but a deep reverence, the starting point of wisdom. At the same time, the story encourages us not to remain trapped in our own unworthiness. God does not reveal himself to condemn us, but to transform us. Just as with Isaiah, we are invited to honestly recognize our faults, but also to remain open to the purifying grace that God offers. After Isaiah's anguished confession, something extraordinary happens. One of the seraphim flies to him with a live coal taken from the heavenly altar, and touching Isaiah's lips with it, declares, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for." This moment is one of significant beauty and depth, representing God's grace in action, responding to sincere confession with purification and forgiveness. Let's examine the elements of this scene and its broader meaning. First, note that it is a seraph who performs the act of purification. These celestial beings, who moments before seemed distant and imposing, now appear as agents of divine grace. This reminds us that in God's economy, even the most exalted beings are at the service of humanity's redemption. The live coal is a powerful symbol. In the Bible, fire often represents God's purifying presence. Think of the burning bush that called Moses, or the tongues of fire that appeared at Pentecost. This heavenly fire has the power to consume what is impure and to refine what is valuable. The fact that the coal comes from the altar is also significant. In the sacrificial system and rituals of the Israelites, the altar was the place where sacrifices were offered to God, symbolizing purification and renewal. In the Old Testament, the altar was where sacrifices were offered for the atonement of sins. Thus, this coal represents the purifying power of divine sacrifice, foreshadowing the final sacrifice of Christ, which would remove sin once and for all. The touch to Isaiah's lips is an act of personal and specific grace. God does not purify him impersonally or from a distance, but touches exactly the point of need confessed by Isaiah, his unclean lips. This reminds us that God knows our particular struggles and offers grace tailored to our needs. The words of the seraph are a powerful declaration of forgiveness and restoration. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. Notice the past tense. It is a complete and final act. There is no waiting period or penance to fulfill. The purification is immediate and total. This act of purification completely transforms Isaiah. The man who moments before said, "I am ruined," is now ready to answer God's call. It is a vivid illustration of the transforming power of divine grace. Isaiah's experience offers a model for our own spiritual journey. Like him, we are called to recognize our need, confess our imperfection, and then receive the purifying touch of God's grace. This process does not occur only once, but is a continuous dynamic in the life of faith. This episode also reminds us that although God's holiness makes us aware of our imperfections, His purpose is not to condemn us. Rather, it invites us to transformation. The vision of divine holiness shows us what we need to become, while divine grace enables us to achieve it. Finally, Isaiah's purification teaches us about true spiritual change, which does not primarily come from our own efforts or determination, but through a transformative encounter with God. It is divine grace, symbolized by the coal from the altar, that has the power to purify us and prepare us for service. After this scene of purification, the narrative takes an unexpected turn. Isaiah hears the voice of the Lord asking, "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" This divine question and Isaiah's response form a crucial point, not only in the prophet's life, but in the entire story of redemption. First, consider the nature of this divine question. God, in his omniscience, certainly already knew whom he would send. So why ask the question? This is a powerful example of how God relates to humanity. He does not impose his will, but invites voluntary participation in his purposes. The question also reveals something about the nature of his mission in the world. God is seeking someone to send, a messenger to communicate his words to the people. This reminds us that he chooses to work through human agents to accomplish his plans on earth. Also, note the use of the plural. Who will go for us? This can be understood as a reference to the Trinity or the language of the heavenly court, including the Seraphim and other angelic beings, emphasizing the greatness and majesty of God. Isaiah's response is immediate and sincere. "Here I am, send me." This is a remarkable transformation. The one who had trembled before God's holiness now responds with readiness and courage. Purified by divine grace, Isaiah is now eager and ready to serve. His readiness is a testimony to the transformative power of encountering God. He does not hesitate, ask for time to consider, or attempt to negotiate the terms of his service. His response is an unconditional yes to the divine call. It's worth noting that Isaiah volunteers before even knowing what his mission will be. He's not responding to a detailed job description, but to a general call to service. This behavior illustrates the essence of true faith, a willingness to follow God, even when the path ahead is uncertain. Isaiah's response also reflects a profound change in his self-perception. From someone who saw himself as ruined and impure, he now sees himself as someone who can be useful in God's service. This is the hallmark of true transformative grace. It not only removes our guilt, but empowers us for a new life of purpose and service. This dialogue between God and Isaiah establishes a pattern repeated throughout Scripture and in the lives of many believers. The divine call often follows a profound encounter with His holiness and an experience of His purifying grace. Isaiah's story challenges us to reflect on our own response to God's call. Are we ready, like Isaiah, to say, "Here I am, send me"? Or are we more inclined to make excuses, hesitate, or attempt to negotiate the conditions of our service? This episode also reminds us that God continues to call people into His service today. The call may not be as dramatic as Isaiah's, but God still asks, "Whom shall I send?" The question is, are we listening, and how will we respond? Isaiah's calling teaches us about the sequence of true spiritual transformation. First comes the encounter with God's holiness, which awakens us to our need, then the experience of purifying grace, and finally, the willingness to serve. This is not only Isaiah's story, but a pattern we can observe in our own lives as we grow in faith. After Isaiah's determined response to the divine call, God reveals the specific nature of the prophet's mission, and the narrative takes an unexpected turn. Isaiah's task will not be easy or at first glance compassionate. God says to Isaiah, "Go and tell this people, be ever hearing but never understanding, be ever seeing but never perceiving. Make the heart of this people calloused, deafen their ears and close their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts and turn and be healed." These words seem shocking at first. Why would God send a prophet with a message that would harden the people's hearts rather than lead them to repentance? To understand, it is essential to consider the context. This is not so much a command for Isaiah to cause spiritual blindness, but a prophetic prediction of the effect his message will have on a people already estranged from God. In other words, God is telling Isaiah that his preaching, instead of immediately leading to repentance, will initially encounter resistance. This passage illustrates a profound spiritual principle. The same message that has the potential to open eyes and transform hearts can also, when rejected, lead to greater hardening. It's like the sun that melts wax but hardens clay. The difference lies not in the message, but in the response of those who hear it. Isaiah's mission also reminds us that success in God's service is not always measured by visible results or positive responses. Isaiah is called to be faithful in delivering the message, regardless of how it will be received. Moreover, this passage shows us that God sometimes uses methods that may seem counterintuitive. The apparent failure of Isaiah's preaching to produce immediate conversion is part of God's greater plan, which ultimately aims to bring his people back to him. Sometimes people must experience the consequences of their estrangement from God before they are ready to turn back to him. Isaiah's response to this challenging mission is remarkable. He doesn't argue with God or request an easier task. Instead, he asks, "For how long, Lord?" This question reflects both Isaiah's understanding of the difficulty of his mission and his hope that the people's resistance will not be permanent. God's answer to Isaiah is equally significant. He speaks of a time of judgment, but also of hope. Even if the nation is reduced to a stump, from this remnant, new life will emerge, a promise of future restoration, even amid judgment. As we saw in Isaiah's vision, the Seraphim hold a unique and elevated place in the celestial order. But how do they fit into the larger picture of angelic hierarchies? This question has intrigued theologians, mystics, and artists for centuries. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, angels are generally organized in a hierarchical structure. One of the most influential classifications was proposed by Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, a Christian theologian of the 5th or 6th century, in his work, The Celestial Hierarchy. Pseudo-Dionysius divided celestial beings into 3 orders, each composed of 3 angelic choirs. At the top of this hierarchy are the Seraphim, followed by the cherubim and thrones, forming the highest order of celestial beings. According to this view, the Seraphim are closest to God, constantly absorbing and reflecting his divine love. The exalted position of the Seraphim in the celestial hierarchy is not merely a matter of rank. It reflects their unique function and their proximity to the divine essence. Seraphim are often seen as guardians of God's throne, continually proclaiming his holiness and serving as direct channels of his ardent love. It is interesting to note that while the Seraphim occupy a prominent role, they are rarely mentioned elsewhere in the Bible. This scarcity of references adds to the mystery surrounding their nature and function. Some scholars suggest that this rarity may be due to their elevated position. They are so close to God that their interaction with human affairs is limited compared to other angelic beings. Cherubim, for instance, appear guarding the Garden of Eden and the Ark of the Covenant, while messenger angels frequently interact with humans in the Bible. In contrast, the Seraphim seem to have a role primarily focused on continuous worship and the proclamation of divine holiness. The image of the Seraphim as supreme worshippers has deeply inspired Christian spirituality over the centuries. Many mystics and contemplatives view the Seraphim as models of the purest form of prayer and devotion, a total, burning adoration free from any selfish consideration. However, it's important to remember that while these angelic ranks have influenced Christian thought, they are not systematically outlined in the Bible. Isaiah's vision gives us a glimpse of the Seraphim, but does not provide a complete hierarchy of heaven. Based on Isaiah's vision, we know that the Seraphim hold a position of extreme closeness to God, continually proclaiming His holiness. They show us that the nearer we are to God, the more we are consumed by His glory, and the more naturally arises our desire to worship Him. The exalted position of the Seraphim also reminds us of the vastness and complexity of the spiritual realm. There is far more to God's creation than what our eyes can see. The existence of these celestial beings broadens our understanding of the cosmos and reminds us of our place as creatures in a vast and wonderful universe. The vision of the Seraphim also presents a fascinating paradox. On the one hand, they occupy the highest rank in the celestial hierarchy, the closest to God. On the other, they show themselves to be the humblest, covering their faces and feet in the divine presence. This teaches us that in God's kingdom, true greatness is found in humility and service. The position of the Seraphim in the celestial hierarchy invites us to expand our view of reality and deepen our desire for devotion, inspiring us to seek a purer, more fervent adoration, free from selfish motivations. And no matter how exalted the Seraphim are, we remember that the God they serve is even more magnificent. The God whom the Seraphim adore is infinitely greater and more wondrous than any representation we can create. The impactful vision of the Seraphim recorded by Isaiah did not remain confined to the pages of the Bible. Over the centuries, these celestial creatures have captured the imagination of artists, writers, and thinkers, leaving a lasting mark on art and culture. In visual art, the Seraphim have been depicted in various ways, reflecting different cultural traditions and interpretations. In early Christian representations, they often appeared as winged human figures, frequently in shades of red to symbolize their fiery nature. Over time, the depictions became more complex. Medieval and Renaissance artists often portrayed the Seraphim with 6 wings, faithfully following Isaiah's description, intricately arranged to cover their bodies and leave only the face visible. A famous example is Giotto's fresco in the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi, Italy, where the Seraphim are shown as red 6-winged figures hovering around God's throne, with intense colors and intricate forms that capture the majesty and mystery of these celestial beings. In literature, Seraphim appear in works ranging from theological treatises to modern fiction. In the Divine Comedy, Dante Alighieri places the Seraphim in the circle closest to God in paradise, describing them as circles of fire spinning around a light that represents the divine presence. Poets like John Milton also drew inspiration from the Seraphim. In Paradise Lost, Milton depicts these beings as part of the heavenly host, using language that evokes Isaiah's vision. In music, the Seraphim have inspired composers over the centuries. The hymn, Holy, 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 based on the cry of the Seraphim in Isaiah 6, is one of the most well-known and beloved hymns in the Christian tradition. Classical composers like Johann Sebastian Bach also incorporated references to the Seraphim in their sacred works. In modern popular culture, Seraphim continue to captivate, appearing in novels, movies, and even video games, often as beings of extraordinary power and beauty. Although these representations do not always follow the biblical description, they attest to the power of the Seraphim's image to capture the imagination. It is worth noting how these depictions of the Seraphim in art and culture often reflect the concerns and values of their times. During periods of intense religious fervor, The seraphim were often portrayed with an almost frightening intensity, emphasizing God's holiness and power. In more recent times, representations tend to focus on the beauty and ethereal nature of these beings. The continuous presence of the seraphim in art and culture serves as a reminder of spiritual reality in an increasingly secular world. They invite us to look beyond the material and mundane, to contemplate the transcendent and the divine. The diversity of representations of the seraphim also reminds us of the limitations of our understanding. No image or description can fully capture the reality of these celestial beings. Each depiction is, at best, an attempt to give form to the ineffable. The various artistic and cultural interpretations of the seraphim invite us to reflect more deeply on the significance of these creatures. What do they reveal about our understanding of God? How do they shape our view of the spiritual world? What lessons can we draw from their unceasing enthusiasm and their proximity to the divine? The enduring presence of the seraphim in art and culture testifies to the impact of Isaiah's vision. Millennia after the prophet recorded his experience, these celestial beings continue to fascinate, inspire, and challenge us to look beyond the ordinary to the extraordinary, from the earthly to the heavenly. The vision of the seraphim in Isaiah 6 offers profound insights into true inspiration. Observing these celestial beings, we learn valuable lessons about how to approach God and express our devotion. First, we notice that the seraphim's praise is unceasing. They never stop crying, "Holy, holy, holy." This suggests that true inspiration is not something that occurs only at specific times or on designated occasions. Rather than being reserved for particular moments or spiritual thoughts, true worship should be the constant state of our hearts, a posture of reverence and praise that permeates every aspect of our lives. The seraphim's inspiration is also centered exclusively on God. They are not occupied with themselves or their own needs. Their cry is entirely about God's holiness and glory, challenging us to reflect on our own devotion, which often becomes focused on ourselves, our feelings, experiences, and needs. The seraphim remind us that true inspiration places God at the center. Additionally, the seraphim's devotion is a direct response to the revelation of God's nature. They do not worship based on hearsay or indirect knowledge. They stand before the throne, beholding God's glory directly, and their motivation flows naturally from this experience. This reminds us of the importance of seeking to know God more deeply, for the more we know Him, the more authentic and natural our enthusiasm will be. The posture of the seraphim is also instructive. With two wings, they cover their faces, showing reverence and humility. This teaches us that true worship always involves a sense of reverent awe. No matter how close we are to God, we must never lose sight of His majesty and holiness. At the same time, the seraphim are active in their service, flying with another two wings, showing that true devotion is not passive, it compels us to action, to active service in obedience to God's will. The content of the seraphim's praise is also significant. They proclaim the holiness of God and declare that the whole earth is full of His glory. This reminds us that true worship involves both the exaltation of who God is, His holiness, and the acknowledgement of how He manifests in creation. It is interesting to note that the seraphim call to one another, suggesting a sense of community in worship. While we should and can worship individually, there is something powerful about joining with others to proclaim the greatness of God. The enthusiasm of the seraphim also has a tangible impact. The temple doors shake and the environment fills with smoke, reminding us that true worship is not merely a mental or emotional activity. It has the power to transform the reality around us. The seraphim's devotion offers us a glimpse of what our eternal occupation in heaven will be. Far from being a monotonous activity, worship will be the ultimate fulfillment of our purpose as creatures made in the image of God. The vision of the seraphim challenges us to elevate our worship, inviting us to a purer, more focused and more continuous devotion. It calls us to go beyond empty forms or fleeting emotions, to an inspiration that flows from a genuine encounter with God's holiness and glory. In a world full of distractions and countless demands for our attention, the Seraphim remind us of what truly matters. They show us that our primary vocation, both now and in eternity, is to worship the holy God who created and redeemed us. The vision of the Seraphim does not only teach us about these celestial beings, it also reveals much about the nature of the God they worship unceasingly. Through their appearance, actions, and words, the Seraphim offer us deep insights into who God is and how he relates to his creation. First, the very existence of the Seraphim speaks to the greatness and majesty of God. These beings made of fire and light, so powerful and glorious that their mere presence makes the temple doors tremble, are merely servants before the divine throne. If the servants are so awe-inspiring, how much more glorious must be the king they serve? The fiery nature of the Seraphim also reveals something about God. In the Bible, fire often symbolizes God's holiness and purifying presence. The Seraphim, as beings of fire, reflect this divine holiness, reminding us that God is a consuming fire, Hebrews 12:29, and that his holiness is so intense it consumes all that is impure. The threefold cry of the Seraphim, "Holy, holy, holy," is a powerful declaration about the nature of God. In Hebrew language, the triple repetition indicates the absolute superlative. God is not just holy, he is incomparably holy, set apart from all creation in his absolute moral perfection. This emphasis on God's holiness corrects our tendency to view him too familiarly or casually. The vision of the Seraphim, immersed in a continuous and fervent worship, invites us to ponder the greatness of God and the depth of our own praise. These celestial beings, with their wings covering their faces and feet, remind us that no matter how close we may come to God, there will always be an unfathomable mystery, a holiness beyond our understanding. They proclaim, "Holy, holy, holy," before the throne, not out of obligation, but from a love that naturally springs from God's presence. May we then learn from these Seraphim, allowing God's glory to transform our hearts and spirits. May our worship be not merely an occasional expression, but a permanent state, a response to the greatness of a God who created us and called us to an eternal purpose. May we place God at the center of everything, recognizing that our highest calling, both now and in eternity, is to worship him with sincerity and depth. May the flame of divine love burn within us, purifying us, illuminating our path, and calling us to a life of pure devotion, free from fleeting motivations. And as we join in the song of the Seraphim, may we find not only our calling, but also true peace, knowing that we stand before the Holy One, the one who is and always will be, infinitely greater than anything we can imagine. Amen.